I mean, the Turkana films took some time to edit, several years, so they came out in successive years, I think. And we did have certain problems in the filming. I don't know if that's of any interest to you,
yeah.
but says something about the remoteness of that place that we were, that it took us, I mean, to get any communications back and forth, we either had to go to Eldoret or to Nairobi, and that was sort of a 2-day journey. And one problem we discovered that I think we'd exposed about 5,000 feet of film and sent it off to the lab, and it took some time to get there, of course, by air freight and then to be processed. And then there were all sorts of delays getting it back to us. I can't remember quite the details of that, but and when those first rushes came back, we discovered that half of it was out of focus. And it was because the lens that we were using, which had been just tested and checked out before we left, the technician had put one element in backwards, so that it was out of focus at one of the positions in the zoom range. So we lost quite a bit of material there, and then we furthermore had problems with the camera motor burning out, and trying to get that repaired in Nairobi and seeing if we could get a substitute motor sent in. So there were these sorts of problems. I've prepared a kind of dossier of the telegrams that were sent and the radio messages and the letters that went back and forth and the shipping dockets, and it's quite interesting to look back and see the history of this, because you sort of forget the frustrations. And then our Land Rover was stolen once, and very luckily we found it again. So all these didn't make for the smoothest of times, but I think also I could tell you something about the problems of setting up such a project, because we had originally intended to go back to GA after making the GA films. But in the interim, Idi Amin took power in Uganda, and it became very difficult. We realized that the country was in such a state that to try to go back would have been very difficult, even if we could have got permission, and probably somewhat dangerous. So we shifted the project over the border into northern Kenya. And the Turkana speak essentially the same language as the GA, and are very closely related. And so that was really the closest group culturally that we could work with. So that then took us to Nairobi instead of to Kampala, and there was a whole procedure that you had to go through to get permission to film, and this involved getting a research permit from the President's office, the Ministry of the President, and permission to film from the Ministry of Information. And I spent many hours sitting in the ante-rooms of these ministries waiting to see high officials. And at the Ministry of Information, they told me to get the permission from them, I would have to produce the research permit from the President's office. So I'd go back to the President's office. They'd say, well, first go to the Ministry of Information, get your permission to film, and then we can grant you the permit. But very luckily, Richard Leakey stepped in at a certain point, because we'd made an association with the National Museums of Kenya. And in about 3 phone calls, Richard was able to sort this out. This was after a month almost of sitting in offices around Nairobi. And then we were sort of off and running and able to go up to Turkana permanently and begin the process of fieldwork, language learning, meeting people, getting to know the senior people in the homesteads that were scattered around the plain, including Lorang. And interestingly enough, Lorang was the one senior man in the area who wanted to have nothing to do with us. He told his wives not to stop by our compound, not to sell us milk, which some of the other women in the area would bring us milk to buy. So we met a number of other very interesting families in the area, including a very charismatic and jovial senior man with a huge family and many wives of his own and many others that he was more or less taking care of because their husband had died, and their husband was his brother, so he was responsible for looking after the widows. And then at some point we thought, well, we've heard about this Lorang, we must at least go and try to meet him. So we went and talked to him for a bit. And we discovered that he was an extraordinarily interesting person. He was, among all those men, he was really the intellectual. He was, he thought about philosophical problems, and he also had the advantage of having been away from Turkana and come back. So he had a kind of perspective on what was happening there that many of these other senior men didn't have. And we found that we got on very well with him after a short time, and he enjoyed talking about what we were doing and what were some of these problems of social change that were occurring. And after a fairly short time then, he said, of course you can film in my compound, there'll be no problem. And from that point on, we ended up filming almost exclusively with Lorang and his family. So it shows that sometimes the people that you get to know first in fieldwork, and indeed especially the people who make a point of contacting you because they think they have something to gain from that, aren't necessarily the best people to work with. So that's really something, just a footnote to add about the Turkana project, that it took that course. And we waited for the first 9 months to see if the rains would in fact come. And it was a very good year for rain. So the weddings went ahead, and Lorang's daughter married, and we were able to follow the course of the bride wealth negotiations and the actual ceremonies until Akai went off to her new family.
And then what? You came back?
Then what? Then I was due back to teach at Rice University, and of course I was late because the wedding season went on, and everything was held up till the last minute. And Jim Blue very kindly stood in for me and made excuses to the dean why I hadn't shown up to teach my courses, and so we came back, and meanwhile something had happened, which was that while we were in Turkana, we'd received a telegram, I should go back. We received a letter that had been forwarded all over the place. It had been sent to Houston first and then somewhere else, and finally it had reached Turkana, and it was an ad from the Aboriginal Institute in Australia, advertising for 2 ethnographic filmmakers to essentially re-establish a film unit at the Institute. And previously they had been making films, but with, in a sense, on a contract basis with Roger Sandel and another filmmaker named Curtis Levy. And they had financed some other films by other filmmakers, but they wanted really to reestablish a film unit with several people, 3 people in it. And oddly enough, they sent me then a telegram inviting me to come to Australia for an interview. We were almost in the middle of this bride wealth negotiation and filming every day, and everything was very tense and very interesting. And there was absolutely no possibility of leaving the situation. Until one day, as I said, the motor on my camera suddenly gave a little curl of smoke came out of it, and it burnt out. And I believe this was the second time we had had problems with the camera motor. And I thought, well, there are several possible solutions to this. I could demount the motor, send it back to Rice University, or I could ask them to try to find a substitute motor and send that. Or I could go to Australia. And so I sent a telegram to Roger Sandall and said, please meet me at the airport in Sydney. I'm on my way to Canberra for an interview. And would you please try to get my Eclair motor repaired in the 2 or 3 days that I would be in Canberra. And of course at that point I had sent a reply telegram to the Institute saying, yes, in fact I am coming for an interview, and they arranged a ticket and I managed to get there. And duly delivered the motor to Roger, who came to the airport, and went to Canberra. Slept through the interview because I was completely jet-lagged, and the phone rang in the motel room, and some secretary from the Institute said, Mr. MacDougall, weren't you supposed to be here at 9 o'clock for an interview this morning? And by then it was about 10 or 10:30. I said, I'll be right over. So I went over and we had the interview, and I don't know, I was in a curious state of mind because they said, these are our plans, this is what we'd like to do. This is the program that we'd like to follow. And I basically said, no, I don't think so. You know, I don't think that's a very good idea, and that's not the way I work, and if I were doing it, I would do it this way and this way and this way. But I didn't really care very much at that point, because my mind was back in Turkana. And they then offered me the job, and in fact, Judith and I had applied as a team, a filmmaking team. So in effect, they were offering us 2 jobs. So got in the plane, picked up the motor in Sydney from Roger, flew back to Turkana, or Nairobi, and got myself back to Turkana, and we carried on. And we'd missed a little bit, but actually things had been a bit stalled in the negotiations, so I don't think we actually missed very much. So that led to the next step, which was to go to work at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, which we did after a year's wait because they had agreed to let me finish up my, I didn't actually have a contract, but I had a commitment to teach for the rest of the year at Rice, and then I was free to leave. So that was how we ended up there. Yeah.
Now Australia.
Australia, yes. Well, we thought we would perhaps stay in Australia for a few years, and we began making films with the Institute. And as it's worked out, we've stayed there ever since. And that was 1975, so it's been over 30 years. Let me tell you something about the prior work of the Institute had been primarily a kind of salvage anthropology, I think, trying to film ceremonies mostly in the Central Desert that were thought to be vanishing and that wouldn't be performed again. So Roger Sandel had done a long series of films with Nicholas Peterson and a few other collaborations he'd had, documenting these events. And also some important work had been done in northern Australia and Arnhem Land. And then Curtis Levy had done a film on the Tiwi Islands and about a mortuary ceremony. And as soon as I arrived in Australia, I was told by the director, Peter Rocco, that they had promised to make another film about the next mortuary ceremony that would be held there. And it was about to take place in about a month, I think, or several weeks away. And it was my job to go and do that, never having really read anything about the Tiwi. And so I got in touch with the anthropologist who was associated with the Institute, Maria Brandel, who was doing field work and had been for some time on Melville Island. And I went there and made that film, you know, very much on short notice. It was really with an ethnography in one hand and a camera in the other, and, you know, talking to Maria late into the night to find out what I could from her and be guided by her in what to film and how to film it. And so that was my first experience filming in an Aboriginal community. I did bring in then somebody who'd been involved, not really centrally in the ceremony, but somewhat peripherally, to assist in the editing. He was a Tiwi man who then provided a kind of commentary on the events in the film, because I found that it would have been almost incomprehensible to an outsider what was happening without some sort of guidance, and I didn't want to use a didactic narration. And I thought if it's possible to get an insider, somebody involved directly in the ceremony to comment, that would be a better solution. And so he came to Canberra and worked through the film with me. And I think that was a practice that we followed in a number of the other films that we made in Aboriginal communities. We had various kinds of collaborations with people from those communities. And in a number of cases, they did commentaries that we used on the soundtrack. And I think we found it very, very different, a very different proposition to film in Aboriginal Australia after having filmed in these African pastoralist societies, where a great premium is placed on being able to speak well and to speak in public and to speculate on the problems of life, which seemed to be totally different from the cultural style of Aboriginal people in many ways, who, when they speak, I mean, some are very eloquent, but the speech is often highly coded and symbolic and makes all sorts of references to things that insiders know all about, but outsiders don't. And so the problem is, how do you make films that are at all accessible to a non-Aboriginal viewer, or even to an Aboriginal viewer from another group? And I think we struggled with that problem over a dozen years and a dozen films, and in a way never quite solved that problem. And I think at a certain point also we realized that despite trying to enter into these collaborative projects with Aboriginal people, you know, the times were changing, and it was important for Indigenous filmmakers to begin making the sorts of films that we had been making before. And in fact, at the Institute, we had a training program for Aboriginal filmmakers who came on, you know, and spent a year or sometimes longer with us, and then went off and made their own films. And I think after, it must have been about a dozen years, we more or less eased ourselves out of the Institute and proposed that the film unit should be dissolved. And we began then to work independently for a while, trying to work again with grants and that sort of thing. We had, at a very early point, appointed a third member of the film unit, who was Kim Mackenzie, who was more or less fresh out of university and had done some film work. And he went on to make, first of all, Waiting for Harry, which was a wonderful film about an Aboriginal ceremony or ritual, but he solved the problem in a very different way, you know, which I thought was very ingenious. And then he went on to make a number of other films following that. But I think at the end of that period, we more or less all shifted out of the film unit.
Can I just ask about one person you mentioned who very sadly died, has just died, Peter Rucko. What was he like to work with?
Yes, well, Peter Rucko was, I mean, he was a very ebullient character and marvelous to work with, in fact, because he was the sort of person who, once he trusted you, gave you something to do, really gave you your head. He left you to do it as well as you possibly could. He didn't interfere. And, you know, he was very loyal to, I think, to his staff, and always full of energy, you know, full of excitement. At that period, the Institute was, you know, the lights would be on late into the night, and people were in and out working at odd hours. And it was a very lively institution. I think gradually it became more bureaucratized, more of a sort of 9-to-5 quasi-governmental institution. It somehow lost that spark when Peter left.
And the other person who often you haven't linked him with this is Ian Dunlop.
Yes.
Was he part of this group, or?
No, Ian had always worked for the first for the Australian Commonwealth Film Unit, which then became Film Australia. So he was based in Sydney, but he had received some funding from the Institute. And actually I had met Ian first, I think, in 1968 at a conference in Los Angeles. And so when I came to Australia, we re-established contact and became friends. And we conferred about many things. For example, if people wanted to use footage from the films we had made, what sort of policy should we have? How would we deal with the problem of the distress that it might cause Aboriginal communities to have films shown in which people had died since the films were made? Those sorts of questions. And we had to sort of devise policies to deal with those questions. And so, although we didn't see a lot of each other, we did have a lot of contact over the years. Yeah.
So when you became freelance, that's the next stage.
Yes.
Is that when you started filming in other parts of the world, or?
Yes, that was the result of...
1985 or?
This was, yes, round about then, a little bit later, 86 or so. I mean, the first thing I did was I had a brief fellowship with the Humanities Research Centre at the Australian National University. I also did some teaching there.
A friend of mine was head of that, I think. He came to Cambridge for a while, I can't remember his name. Do you remember who was?
Well, it was Ian Donaldson.
That's right.
Was the director of the Humanities Research Centre.
Yes, I worked with Ian.
That's right. And Anthony Forge was the chairman of the anthropology department. So I was sort of back and forth a bit. I was kind of visiting fellow at the anthropology department for a while. And then Judith and I applied for something called a documentary film fellowship, which had been established by the Australian Film Commission in conjunction with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So it was television plus the Film Institute, or the Film Commission. And every year they awarded a fellowship to a different documentary filmmaker to make a film that would eventually be shown on ABC television. So we applied and we proposed a film about still photography. And we didn't have a very clear proposal in mind actually about what sort of film it would be, but we tried to describe in our proposal the ideas behind it and the fascination that we had with looking at photographs, particularly old ones, and ones that you would find in odd places like bureau drawers and in antique shops and junk shops. And we found it extraordinarily that it was extraordinary that these documents, which are in a way the most personal sort of document you can have, are so easily lost and just get scattered and separated from the conditions in which they were made, separated from the families that know who the person in the picture is. And we proposed making a film that might, I think one idea we proposed was that we could simply find 10 lost photographs and make a film that would be a kind of detective story about trying to find out who were the people in these pictures, where they'd been taken, when they'd been taken, try to trace maybe one of them back to somebody who actually had direct contact with the picture. We didn't end up doing that. We did something quite different. But they gave us the fellowship. So with that, at that point we were invited to an ethnographic film conference being held in India, in the palace of the Maharaja of Jodhpur. And his cousin had organized this conference, and it was attended by many, many people. I had never been to India except to stop over in Bombay airport once, on that time when I flew from Turkana to Australia. And at the conference we just began talking about the idea for this film with a number of people. And a number of our Indian acquaintances there said, why not make the film in India? You know, we have a long tradition of photography. Almost as soon as photography was invented, there were studios popping up in the major cities of India, by the 1850s, in fact. And there were many sort of amateur photographers in the very early years in India, and then a long history after that. But despite that, there are many people in India who have never had their picture taken, and many others for whom there might exist one picture, perhaps even a picture taken at their wedding, or something like that. And so you have this extraordinary range of experiences of photography. And we thought, why not? Why not do this? We had thought of doing it in Australia, possibly. We had thought of perhaps doing it in Africa, where we had some prior experience, but this seemed a very interesting proposition. So we began traveling. We made a bit of a trip around to different places, and we had a kind of notion that we should try to find a large village or a small town in which there was a single photographer and look at the relationship between the photographer and the photographer's clientele. What sort of pictures were made there, what purposes they fulfilled, what sort of functions they were about. Were they, key rites of passage? Were they, what could they tell us about the community in a way? And we looked fairly widely, and we asked all sorts of people whether we could find such a place, where to look. And we never did find it. We couldn't seem to find that situation. Either the village was big enough so that it had several photographers, or it had none. And then if you went to the next step higher to a slightly larger town, it might have 10 or 20 studios. And I think, we'd been reading the novels of Narayan, and like the sign painter, and he focuses on these key figures in the small community of Malgudi, and through that person, through the teacher, through the sign painter, whatever, he gives you a wonderful insight into the life of the village. And I think that's what we had thought. Maybe there's a photographer like that. And I'm sure perhaps it exists somewhere, but we didn't find it. So the next step was that we had made contact with an organization called INTAC, which you may know, which is the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. And we met the director of INTAC, Martin Singh, and he said, why don't you go up to this hill town, Mussoorie, north of Delhi, because there's all sorts of photography there going on. You might find it interesting. So we took the train to Dehradun and then went up to Mussoorie. And indeed, it was a fascinating place. It's a hill town where British colonial officials went during the hot season, just as they went to Simla, and some of the Indian princes built summer bungalows there, and there were other installations. There was a military hospital and so forth. And lots of tourists, and I would say 99% Indian middle class tourists. And they would flock to Mussoorie during certain seasons. During the winter it was completely empty, except for the local residents, and then there'd be these waves of people coming from Bombay, and another wave from Calcutta, and another wave of the Delhiites who would come different times of year. And there were all sorts of photographers in Mussoorie. There were photojournalists. We met a few of them who, produced beautiful coffee table books of the Himalayas, and then there were the old studio photographers who originally had taken pictures of families, had taken portraits on glass plates, and by this time had more or less lost that clientele and were doing sidelines like photocopying. They'd buy a photocopier and make some money from that. Or since there are hundreds of schools dotted around the hills, they would take photographs of class sports events, sports teams, and make a living that way. or they would take in rolls of film from amateurs and send them for processing. So we found those photographers, and then there were also what they called the outdoor photographers, or tourist photographers, who would take photographs of the tourists who came there every year. Because at that time not many Indian tourists had their own cameras, so they would pay a bit of money. And the other thing that you would do if you were a tourist would be to go to these photographers. They would dress you in costumes, and then they'd pose you in front of a beautiful backdrop landscape, a real landscape, unlike the other studio, the earlier studio pictures, which have been often against a painted backdrop.
Careful with your arms.
Sorry, yeah.
And this ended up as a photo wallet.
So this ended up as photo wallets, yeah.